Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, everybody. I'm so glad to see you here this evening and look forward to telling you about some new research that we have going on at Clare Channel Islands and also out on our beautiful Channel Island on microplastics and ocean. So many of you will have heard of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's an example of an accumulation of ocean litter in one of the circulating bodies of water in our ocean basin. So there are 5 major oceanic gyres, and the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is located in the North Pacific Gyre, but you can see there are other areas of circulation in the ocean, and these are areas that marine debris or ocean litter, sometimes called, tends to accumulate. So when we hear about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, you might imagine a big pile of trash swirling around in the ocean. But the reality of these areas of accumulation of microplastic, of ocean litter, is that they tend to be quite well dispersed and often very small pieces of these microplastics. I'm sorry. So in actuality, we get this sort of soup of little plastic particles that are fairly well dispersed. So you don't see a great concentration of plastic floating around in the ocean. One of the issues with, so some of the problems that we have around ocean litter is that we are adding about 8 million metric tons of debris to our oceans every year, and that's being added on top of this circulating mass of about 150 million metric tons of debris in the ocean, and the vast majority of this is plastic. Sorry, I'm a little enthusiastic with this. And so one of the issues is that we're producing an awful lot of plastic. It's a great material. It's very useful to us. We can produce it in a lot of different ways that are very handy. But we've ramped up production of plastics really quickly over the last 50 years or so. So we've gone from, we have now about a yearly production of about 500 million tons. So we've got this really rapid increase in production of plastics. So we've produced in total about 8 billion metric tons of plastic, and all of that plastic doesn't really break down, it doesn't really degrade. So all of that plastic is somewhere on the planet. About 80% of it is 80% of the waste that's been produced of that production is still sitting in landfill somewhere, and only about 9% gets recycled or used. Some plastics have a relatively long use time, about 5 years on average, but the large increase in plastic production recently has been in packaging materials, which get used relatively quickly. The use time is usually about less than 6 months, and that is currently about half of all plastic waste is plastic packaging. So this is both a local and a global scale problem. I'm going to be talking about some of the work we're doing locally, but we need to think of this in the global context. So we find plastic litter in pretty much every environment that we live in on planet Earth, from the deep ocean seafloor, beach sediments, in submarine canyons, in the open ocean. So it's really everywhere that we have looked in the marine environment, we're finding evidence of anthropogenic ocean litter. And it comes from a variety of sources. So that can be land-based sources that come about because of inefficient waste management. So the debris kind of escapes the waste stream, maybe gets blown into a river or washed into a river, and then eventually everything flows downstream in the ocean. By direct littering in some places, in our culture, it's relatively rare that you see somebody littering, but in some cultures, there's really nowhere to dispose of debris and the environment. And then it can also pass through waste treatment systems, be washed into storm drains, and end up traveling down rivers into the ocean. So those are land-based sources of ocean litter. We can also have ocean-based sources. So the things like commercial shipping can produce can produce debris in the ocean. If a tanker or a shipping container falls overboard during a storm or something, that can be problematic. Recreational and commercial fisheries can produce ocean litter, and a lot of the debris that is circulating in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, about half of that debris is from discarded fishing gear or lost fishing gear. And then other operations, military endeavors, drilling platforms, this kind of thing, can produce ocean-based debris. Yes, on the other side. Yeah, sure. Thank you. Okay, so thinking about different sources of ocean litter. So I mentioned the mismanaged municipal waste. And so you can see in the areas on the land in this image that are kind of highlighted, the lighter colors mean there's more likely to be mismanaged litter or municipal waste. And so the very lightest colors are more than 10,000 tons a year of mismanaged municipal waste. So you can see there's certainly areas in North America where we're suffering from that problem, and other places around the world where there's high human population densities and not necessarily an adequate waste management system. Some of the major sources of ocean litter are traveling down rivers. So these plastics that are carried down watersheds and into rivers and out into the ocean can be particularly problematic. About 15 of those worst 20 polluting rivers are in Asia, and others of them, like the Amazon and South America. So those are some of the sources. So marine debris traveling from the land and ending up in the ocean, usually via major rivers. And so these little pink circles are places that people have gone out to look for ocean litter and found in the very largest circles more than 5 pounds per square mile. So that doesn't sound like very much when it's sort of dispersed over that relatively large area, but there are some areas of large concentration, huge fishing nets that have been discarded and other kind of big clumps of debris out there, as well as microplastics, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. So you can see, I mentioned the Great Pacific Garbage Patch as being in the area of the North Pacific gyre circulation. You can see in other areas of the South Pacific and the Atlantic, North Atlantic and South Atlantic gyres. You can see there's areas of circulation there too. Some areas of concentration of ocean litter. So why is it a big deal? Why is ocean litter a problem? So some of the major issues are with risks to wildlife. So the problem of entanglement can be very difficult for animals. They become wrapped up in discarded fishing gear or some discarded packaging. The issue of ingestion, so animals eating plastic, usually mistakenly, but they have a hard time distinguishing plastics from food, such as this albatross chick here that has ingested plastics, been fed plastic because the parent has picked up litter in the ocean thinking that it's food and fed it to the chick. And that produces a number of problems, but in some of these cases it's really just a question of false satiation. So the animal thinks it's belly, where its belly is technically full, so it's not hungry. So they can starve to death or they can have impaction in the gut. So ingestion by itself is problematic. And then there's also issues of chemicals that are associated with plastic. So we add things to plastic to make them useful in certain ways, like phthalates and plasticizers to make them soft, maybe some UV resistance, those types of properties. So there's chemicals that are added to plastics, but then plastics themselves have this propensity to attract organic chemicals, so pesticides and other kind of nasty chemicals will tend to be chemically attracted to the surface of plastic. So when animals are ingesting plastic, they're not just ingesting the polymer, they're also ingesting additional chemicals along with that. And then another example I have down here is that floating trash in the ocean can be a way of animals being transported, invasive species potentially being transported, and that was one of the concerns. After the Japanese tsunami in 2011, we had this circulating debris from that disaster, some of which has ended up on the west coast of North America, and bringing with it creatures that are not native to here, so potential for invasive species there. And then not only risks to wildlife, but also the additional cost, the economic cost. It costs money to clean up beaches and remove debris. It can be impactful to fisheries, can impact property values and also visitation. People don't want to necessarily go to a beach that is covered in ocean litter. And we're seeing, there's been a lot of publicity, I think, recently about some beaches in the Caribbean, touristy kind of beaches that are, people are less interested to go there because of the problems of marine debris. So, yes, sir. Sure, why not?
I had a question about algae being on plastic, and I'm told that that's in fish rather than just ingesting plastic itself. But the reason they do that is algae grows on the plastic, and they're actually trying to consume the algae. Is there any
that could certainly
validity
be
to
true.
that?
Yeah, so pretty much anything that's floating in the ocean starts to develop a biofilm, and things could grow on the surface of it. And so, in terms of palatability, it might be the biofilm that the organism is tasting and thinking that it's food. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay, so you mentioned like after the tsunami that hit Tokyo, there was a huge debris field that came out in the ocean and brought invasive species. Was that primarily plastics or woods or?
It was all of the infrastructure for the coast. So it was not only plastic, but plastic is buoyant; it tends to float. So a lot of the debris that was floating, there were floating docks, there were boats, there were plastic. So it was a real mixture of debris. But, one of the big concerns was in Oregon. There ended up being a dock that had a lot of encrusting organisms on it, and so the risk is that those organisms that would normally be a coastal organism on a different coast are brought here. They could potentially be invasive. So the vast majority of what's floating around in the ocean as litter is plastic, and we can sort of categorize it in different ways. But one of the sort of accepted categories for plastics and microplastic is that what we're calling microplastics are items that are plastic and smaller than 5 millimeters, so less than about the width of your fin. But that can be a whole variety of things. It can be things that are created to be very small, like microbeads that are found in personal care products, detergents. It can also be these raw plastic materials that are then used for manufacturing, so pellets and flakes that are created to be small and then manufactured into something. We can have microfibers, so things like polyester and nylon, polypropylene that are narrow fibers. And then there are secondary microplastics, which are things that used to be something larger and then have gotten broken down, like a plastic water bottle or a tire, something like that. And so those are things that used to be large and then get broken up into smaller and smaller pieces. So when I'm talking about microplastics, I'll be referring to things that are smaller than about 5 millimeters, but that can go all the way down to nanoparticle sizes. So the risk is then that these small items are of a size that is easily ingestible by animals, and so these microbeads here that we filtered out of the personal care products are about the same size. These are grunion eggs on the bottom here. So grunion eggs would be, food for an organism on the coast, and they're about the same size, and so they look similar to their food. So the likelihood is that filter feeding organisms that are capturing food, like our little friend the sand crab, that everybody probably is. Everybody that's been to the beach here has probably seen a little sand crab. They're filter feeding, they're capturing particles out of the surf, and they might be eating these plastic particles. Other filter feeding organisms, we know things like mussels, are also capturing these particles. And so these microplastics, just like the larger pieces of plastic are problematic, these small particles are problematic in a number of ways. So they can physically break up and degrade into nanoparticles, so these very, very small particles that are actually capable of moving around in the body, moving through tissues. And some studies have shown that they cause behavioral changes in fishes when these nanoparticles make their way into the fish's brain. And they have multiple mechanisms of toxicity. So they physically can be toxic. They also can be chemically toxic. They're very palatable, either through biofilms or just because they look good to eat. They're of a size that's really ingestible. So as I mentioned, the things that plankton and that sort of small organisms, that's about the size that they would be ingesting. And so far, they seem to be fairly ubiquitous. They're very durable, and so they persist in the environment for a long time. And so one of the concerns we have then is not just that we're finding microplastics, but that they can entering the food chain and being passed from one organism to another. As a smaller critter is eaten by a bigger critter, then these plastics are being passed up the food chain. And so one of the issues that I was concerned about relating to our national parks is, everything's kind of connected in the ocean. And so the fact that islands might be remote from human habitation, or they might be a protected area, isn't necessarily protective to this type of pollution. So the people have been looking for plastics in the ocean, finding them in all kinds of places. In the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, some recent studies have estimated about 8% of the material floating around in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is microplastics, these small particles. Almost half of the remaining debris is fishing nets and other large fishing gear, miscellaneous fishing gear. And that can be abandoned fishing gear or lost fishing gear that no longer has a useful life, and it costs too much to transport it back to port and recycle. So that in these circulating gyres, we can see these concentrations of plastic, and even some really remote uninhabited islands like Henderson Island. I'll see if the video will work for me. Josh, if you could see if this will work. So Henderson Island is an uninhabited island in the South Pacific. Oh, sorry, didn't work. Sure. So this is an example. This is a small island in the South Pacific. It's about 3,000 miles from a mainland. But you can see just the variety of debris that's on this beach. And also the authors of this study dug down. I'm sorry, it's not great quality video, but they dug down into the beach and found really high density of buried plastics too. So it's not just what we're seeing on the surface. So even in these places that are remote from human habitation, this plastic debris is washing up ashore. And then Midway Atoll I mentioned as being the canaries in the coal mine. These albatrosses that are fishing over a really wide swathe of ocean are collecting all its plastic debris and feeding it to their chicks and causing really high mortality in the chicks. And so we could think of them maybe as the canaries in the coal mine of this problem. So we have both the sort of plastic soup of microplastics, large clumps of discarded fishing gear floating around in the ocean, and then also washing up on shores. And even in remote places like Antarctica, where there's no permanent human habitation, we're seeing these microplastics starting to appear, small fibers of nylon and polyester and such, floating around in the Southern Ocean. And so the concern then is that these are getting into the food chain. It may be a risk to human health. We haven't really determined that yet, but certainly we know that filter feeding organisms that we eat, like mussels, are consuming these. They've been found all in a whole bunch of places around the world. The majority of mussels sampled around the UK coast and in supermarkets prepared for human consumption have microplastics in their tissues. We found it in sea salt, in tap water, it's in beer. So it's very few places that we don't find microplastics. So I want to tell you today a little bit about the work that we're doing out on the Channel Islands. This is a project that has multiple goals. I'm really going to focus today on the cleanup and the microplastics portion of this, but our goal is to, on a few beaches in the Channel Islands, to clean up and monitor arrival of new debris, so we know the rate at which debris is arriving, and the types of debris that are there, so we can address that as a cleanup issue. And then to quantify any ecological effects of marine debris. Are we seeing it getting into the food chain? Are we seeing entanglements or ingestion? And then also to promote environmental stewardship. So we have sites on the mainland and the islands, so we can engage local schools with doing beach cleanups locally and compare the results from the mainland and the islands. So we have 9 sites, 2 in Oxnard on the local coast here, and then 3 sites on Santa Cruz Island and 4 sites on Santa Rosa Island. And there's a whole host of challenges that come along with working in some of these remote sites. You can see we've arrived to do a survey here, and there's elephant seals that are on the beach, so that means that we can't go on that beach to sit. And so there's really important issues here. One is that these are islands that are relatively remote from the coast here. Obviously, they're only a few tens of miles off our coast and really high human population density in this part of the world, but they're remote and uninhabited islands that are protected as part of the national park. There are also areas that are really important to wildlife. So here are some of our pinniped friends, and you can see there's some kids' toys and some discarded or lost fishing buoys. So these beaches that are really important places for pinnipeds molting and seabirds feeding are really important places to the Channel Islands. So the remoteness of these places makes it really challenging to get to. And unfortunately, some of the debris on the islands is rather large and very heavy. So a lot of this sort of physical labor goes on in removing this debris and completing the surveys. And so I'll just give a shout out to this is Michaela Miller, who's our program manager for this project, and another professor at Channel Island, Matt Formansky, who are doing some of the hard work there. So we've collected, yes, sir.
Conception.
So the question is on the location of our sites. The sites are chosen on the islands, particularly Santa Rosa. The sites were chosen to replicate some historical surveys that were done in the 1990s. We wanted to be able to compare the data. And also a question of accessibility and sensitivity to cultural resources out there. So there's some important archaeological sites that mean that we don't want to use those for our work because we don't want to impact the archaeological treasures. Yeah. But I'll just mention, I think it could be important to the circulation patterns and the arrival of debris. The location, the aspect of the sites is really important. You could try that. Yeah, that's a possibility. So the question is, is it possible to go after the potential source of pollution? There has been a recent change in the fishing regulations in the sanctuary, so that lobster traps have to be individually labeled, and there's also been a reduction in the total number that each fishing license is allowed to have. And that's some of the work that we're doing is following how well that system is working and in encouraging people to keep control of their gear and not maybe have it end up.
Thank you for your engagement and asking us to please hold our questions till the end to help keep the flow and your time safe. That's okay.
Okay, so in terms of what we've been able to collect so far on the Channel Islands, this project has been going, this is our second year. I'm hoping to at least continue for the next year, and then if we get funding to continue into the future. So the work that we've been doing in Cal State Channel Islands, we've collected about 1.3 tons of trash, have been hiked on those frame packs off of the islands. And also with our partners at NOAA, with the shear water, we've been able to actually get the boat in a little bit closer and do some really good work removing about 5.9 tons there. So far we've removed almost 3 tons of trash from the islands, and this is a relatively small area. But one of the things we're trying to do is sort of repeatedly go back to the same places and keep removing the debris that washes ashore, and so we can see the accumulation rates and how good of an effect we're having in terms of removing debris. So in terms of what we're removing, about 40% of it is plastics, and about 20% of it is fishing debris, and that's just on the islands. And I'll show you a little bit of data for that. So the way that we're doing these surveys, it's 3 instances of 100 meters of shoreline, and then it's the entire width of the beach. So if you're doing a beach cleanup this weekend, you'll probably be cleaning the whole beach from end to end. We physically just can't carry all of that material up the beach. So we have 3 replicates of 100-meter transects, and we just clean that 100 linear meters. We clean that whole area of the beach from the shoreline to the back of the beach. So I've summarized the data by island. So we can see Santa Cruz Island has relatively little accumulation. This is just how many items of anthropogenic trash are we picking up. You can see, so Santa Cruz is relatively little. Santa Rosa, and this might get back to the aspect of the beach, Santa Rosa has relatively more, and the mainland tends to have the most. So one of the things we're looking for as this project goes on, we'll get a better sense of seasonal data. We might expect there to be seasonal accumulation based on things like the fishing season, lobster season, the periodic rainfall that we have in California. So we have these big rainfall events. We hope that will tend to wash out the rivers and maybe carry more debris down. So we might tend to see more in the rain part of the year. So we see maybe a little bit of that beginning to come out, but as we continue to collect data, we should maybe see a little bit more seasonality in that data. In terms of the weight of what we've been removing, you can see there's a little bit of a different picture now. So Santa Cruz Island, again, is fairly low. The mainland, in terms of the weight of trash, we're picking a lot of items, but they tend to be small. So like cigarette butts and small fragments of plastic, bottle caps, those kind of things. On Santa Rosa, you can see some of the large removals that we've done have been both fishing debris, like lobster traps, a very heavy item, and some large pieces of plastic. So that's what this looks like a little bit more. Again, in terms of number of plastic items, in red here, you can see the mainland tends to be the most, tends to be a little bit higher in fall and winter. But again, Santa Rosa, we're seeing accumulation on these west-facing beaches of plastic debris. So that's plastic debris that's coming from outside of the island. So it's washing ashore from somewhere else, probably from our mainland. But we have seen things like debris from the tsunami and other things washing ashore that are from much further afield. So number of plastic items, and you'll see the scales are different here. So there's a lot more items of plastic than there are items of fishing items. But you can see we're kind of having an effect here. We're seeing some sort of downward trend as we keep going back and moving more and more of this lost fishing gear. We're seeing a decline in the amount that's there, but we're still seeing some accumulation. And so then, and that's why I have this slide here, the location of these beaches, these are the ones that tend to be accumulating a lot of lost fishing gear. One down here at Skunk Point tends to get relatively less. And these Santa Cruz Island ones are getting relatively small amounts of accumulation. Okay, so I have a few minutes to tell you about microplastics. So this is work that I started about 3 years ago. This is a view of a beach in Ventura. And these little fragments of plastic now really catch my eye when I go to the beach. I see these little microplastic items all the time. So around, you hear people talking a lot in California right now about a straw ban or trying to get rid of certain personal single-use plastics. So that's a popular thing. Around the time that I started the study, we were talking about microbeads. So ban the microbead. There's a lot of political will about having some legislation to regulate microbeads. And so I was working on beaches, and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to see if there's any microbeads on these beaches? So we started looking for this using some fairly simple technology to suspend the plastics out of the sand. So we had to separate them from the sediment, and we did this with a simple density separation using a hypersaline, so very salty water, and then we just filter off the liquid. And then what we were finding, so these are sand grains, these little grains here, we're finding little fibers, so little synthetic fibers, and some small particles, or slightly larger particles. Here's another synthetic fiber. So this is a fairly conservative method in that we're only classifying things as plastic. They really look artificial. They're artificially colored, and sort of confirm that they're man-made and not natural. So we've done this all around the world. We've been able to get sand from a whole bunch of different places. This is mostly opportunistic in that somebody gave sand to us, or was going on vacation somewhere, or some work that we did down in the Cook Islands. So, but it's fairly representative of a whole bunch of different places around the world. And this is one of the remote atolls that we've been doing work in the South Pacific in the Cook Islands. So it turns out everywhere we went looking for microplastics in sand, we found it. So this is in California in terms of how many items per 200 milliliters, so it's about a cupful of sand. So in Cook Islands, we're also finding it. In Hawaii, it's in the center of one of those large oceanic gyres. They tend to get a lot of marine debris accumulating on their beaches, and so on around the Caribbean and Italy and the Philippines. So we're finding microplastics in pretty much every beach sand that we looked at. And I just will point out that most of what we find in California is fibers, so synthetic fibers, like you'd find from lint trap in your dryer, from clothing or industrial carpeting. But other places, we're seeing more sort of fragmented particles of plastic. And I don't expect you to be able to read all the beach names on the bottom of this slide, but this is about 58 different beaches that we've looked at in California, beginning on the left at Avila Beach up north, and all the way down to Crystal Cove in the south. So this is just north of Point Conception, and then this long stretch here is Santa Barbara and Ventura counties, going down into the Malibu coastline. And then these are the beaches of the Channel Islands. So there's not really much in terms of a north-south trend, maybe a little bit higher as you get closer to Los Angeles. But you can see, in general, the microplastic that we're finding in the beach sand of the Channel Islands is relatively less than we're seeing across all of the beaches that we have. And so we can look at that, then we can sort of group these together. So this is, for those that we have a lot of samples for, this is a littoral cell, a compartment of sand transport. So we have the Santa Barbara cell here, the Zuma cell, and the Santa Monica cell, and then we're lumping together Santa Rosa and Santa Cruz, the Channel Islands. So you can see that the Channel Islands is significantly lower than anywhere off the Atlantic coast, which is sort of what we would hope, but we have confirmation here. So the question then is, are these microplastics likely to be ingested by organisms that are living on our beaches? And there's filter feeding organisms like the sand crab, there's filter feeding fishes like the blacksmith, and then organisms that are higher up the food chain, like the barred surf perch, that might be interested in eating the sand crab. Maybe those microplastics, if the sand crab is eating them, might pass up the food chain. So this is work that one of my undergraduate students did. She's now a graduate student and continuing her research in microplastics. And so she captured sand crabs from beaches all along the California coast and dissected them looking for these little microplastics, and actually found microplastic fibers, and in some cases a little microbead the crabs have actually ingested. So as they're filter feeding, they're picking up these little particles and swallowing. And so of 38 beaches that she looked at, she found that that at least some of the crabs that she was looking at had ingested microplastics. So overall, about 35% of crabs had ingested microplastics along the California coast. We're also looking then at these barred surf perch that might be eating crabs. The very first one that that one of my students opened up, we found some plastic fishing lures that were in the belly, just kind of sitting there. and also found some little bits of plastic film and some microplastics in the forest approach too. So we know that they're directly eating plastics. And again, I'll just reiterate that it's not just the fact that they're eating plastic, it's also the possibility that there are associated chemicals that are being ingested. So a lot of work is going on right now in this emerging field of microplastics to look at this tissue transfer of chemicals that might be associated with plastics and seeing if they might be causing problems for organisms that are eating plastics. So we have ongoing research looking for these possibility of ingestion of microplastics and pollution pathways to see how microplastics are getting into the environment. Looking at biological impacts or ecological impacts of microplastic pollution, we know it's a ubiquitous problem. We find it everywhere we look, but is it really causing genuine problems in the environment? And then is there trophic transfer? Are these problems being passed on in the food chain? So I'll just mention that this is a very worthwhile effort, even though it takes a lot of physical work to do this, to go out to the Channel Islands and to pick up this trash. I'll make a plug for Coastal Cleanup Day this Saturday. The Park Service is hosting coastal cleanup, and they're all happening all around the state. It's worth it to keep these really important beaches as pristine as possible, both for the animals that live there and for the people that visit the national parks. And I have to thank a whole host of partners. So this is a really big project that a lot of community partners are helping us out with. The NOAA Marine Debris Program, the National Park Service, the Island Packers, and other partners that are helping us with this work to keep the beaches of the Channel Islands. Thank you. So I think we have a few minutes for questions. Sarah has the microphone, and she'll come to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah. We have a question over here.
I'm concerned about the mussels because if you fry mussels, you're frying plastic, and plastic is toxic. That sounds like a real bad combination.
So the question is that is it problematic that if you're eating something that might have ingested plastic, like a mussel, is that potentially going to be harmful? And so that's the risk. We don't have any strong evidence yet that would be a direct impact to human health, but we know that mussels are ingesting plastics. This is an active area of research. So there's a lot of work going on in that field right now, but this is one of the concerns that we've certainly found microplastics in the human food chain. The question is then, how problematic is that for people? Yeah, somebody in the, somebody over here. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to let you know that there's going to be a project There's going to be a project starting here fairly shortly where we're going to be, for the State Department of Health, we're going to be harvesting mussels on the islands and shucking them, taking the viscera out of there, and the viscera will be sent up to Sacramento to be analyzed. But in the process of doing that, we may learn something about, what's in the mussels also. So, in fact, I have contact with the people at the State Department of Health, and I will forewarn them. So that's something that they should be looking for.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
I've actually been working on some protocols to look at that exactly. So we haven't started to work out the islands yet, but working on the protocols for digesting the tissues and mussels.
So following along that, so a fish, if it eats some plastic, is there any evidence that the plastic gets from the stomach into the actual tissue, the muscle of the fish?
So the question is, if a fish consumes plastic, can that plastic then actually pass from the gut into the fish's tissues? And I would extrapolate from that, that's the part of the fish that we eat, right? So one of the issues with mussels is that we eat the whole organism, and we eat its gut frequently. With fishes, fishermen usually gut fish, and so if the fish is eating plastic, then that's not necessarily going to people. We do know that some very, very small particles, nanoparticles, can pass from the gut into the tissues. So that's one possibility of a problem. The other might be if there are chemicals that are associated with plastic. So even if the plastic isn't passing into the tissues of the fish, then plasticizers or PCBs or DDT might be able, those organic chemicals, those pesticides and other things might be able to pass from the gut and into the tissue.
Hi, I'm Genevieve, and I'm from, as I mentioned earlier, I'm from Detroit and Michigan, and I came here for this lecture as well as the coastal cleanup day coming up on Saturday. And I'm the director of a volunteer program for an urban island park that is a little bit bigger than Central Park. It's on the Detroit River between Michigan and Canada. And within that program, I've developed an anti-littering campaign. Michigan, you may or may not know, is not nearly as forward thinking as California is when it comes to, we don't have any kind of tax on plastic. We plastic water bottles are very much a thing, not a lot of reusable, a lot of disposable plastic bags, things like that. So within the anti-littering campaign, I'm utilizing our volunteer program, which we have a very great support from the community and the corporate world in Detroit at the park. So utilizing that for anti-litter efforts, and removing plastic from our waterways, which leads into the Detroit River, which leads into the Great Lakes. But what I also want to do on a more global level is shift the social behavior. So starting in Detroit on Belle Isle, but then having a ripple effect through the Great Lakes region. And I was wondering if you have any suggestions on how to start that just shift in social behavior. I have the volunteer support that does the cleanups, for as much as 2,000 volunteers a year can do, but how to just change the way of thinking a little bit to kind of catch up with the West Coast.
Thank you. I can't really
It's a big
summarize
question.
that, but I'll. The question is really how do we create change in the behaviors that people do to improve our environment? Is that a fair summary? And so I'm glad that you asked because it was actually a big part of the conception of this project. And I haven't really talked about that today. I really just talked about the microplastics research. But a big part of this project was to work with local schools. So we work with local elementary schools. We take them out into the field. So there's a whole curriculum around the marine environment. And so we work with local schools, we take them out to the beach, we do microplastics demonstrations with them. And so we're really trying to expose local students to, first of all, go to the beach and sort of see it as a natural habitat and as a valuable thing that's really useful for local shorebirds and little critters that live in the sand. So seeing the beach as a living habitat and then looking with them at the effects of plastic. And so I think that's the probably most effective way to create social change is talk to kids about it. They are the ones that, well, I'd rather see a sand crab than a piece of plastic, So they're much more likely to respond to that and integrating that into the curriculum of learning and getting them out into the field consistently clean up. But I think we have to capitalize right now. There's a lot of social and political will around changing behaviors, and some of it has to be voluntary. Some of it has to be societal. So the way that we use plastic really has to change. Just the volume of plastic that we're using, some portion of that is going to escape waste streams and end up in the ocean. So we really have to do source reduction, find alternatives, and address social behavior to make people aware of their impact. This was a partnership from the get-go, yeah. And then there's other parts of this lecture that I sort of put them after the end title slides about local policy initiatives. So I'd be happy to talk to you about local and statewide and global policy initiatives going on right now to address the issue of plastics, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Steele, for coming here tonight. It's a great presentation. I'm enjoying it. My question was, are you aware of any new technologies or methods that companies might be looking into removing all this debris and the plastics from the oceans?
Yes, so that's the other end of the spectrum. So I just mentioned source reduction as being one of the easy ways to address that. On Saturday, those of us that are working in coastal cleanup will be trying to remove plastics before they break down into smaller particles that we can't recover. There is a project going on right now in the North Pacific Gyre, the ocean cleanup, to try and capture debris. So they have a floating boom system to capture debris. So there's a lot of interest. Cleanup is really the hardest part of the job, particularly when it's very dispersed or very remote. Just the fuel, the energy required to bring back debris from the Great Pacific Garbage Patch in the North Pacific Gyre, and then what do we do with that debris? So it's really, I think, more important to focus on source reduction than cleanup. But having said that, there are things that we can do to maybe stop things at river mouths from, stop things getting out into the ocean. $150 million tons, yeah. And a lot of it may already be inaccessible. So I'm really just talking about what's visible on the surface. So not all plastics float. About 46% of manufactured plastics don't float. And so that's why it's ending up in deep ocean places that we're not able to recover it, or it's not energy efficient to recover it. So it's really, I think, more important to focus on the source reduction. Somebody on the side had a question.
Has anybody tried talking to the manufacturers to encourage them to use other materials rather than plastic? When you buy a new tire, you have to pay a fee for the disposal of the old tire. All this fishing equipment that you're finding, I don't know. But are there any inroads that the public can help with to sort of put pressure on manufacturers?
That's a really good question. So the question is about tackling or addressing the issue of plastic pollution with the manufacturers of plastic. Yeah, so we just worked on a statewide policy to address ocean litter in California, and the American Chemistry Council are very vocal contributors to that discussion because it's in the manufacturers of plastic interest to manufacture more plastic. Right? It's part of the business model. So there have to be incentives from the societal end of things that either we consume less plastic or we are vocal enough to demand alternatives to plastic or truly biodegradable plastics. So I think it has to come either from society or from legislature to sort of drive change in the manufacturers' behavior.
Two questions. One, you were making reference to that project that's going out there to try and get some of that. One, do you think it's going to work? Because it made a big splash on the news, and so I kind of wondered. It's an idea. And the other is, your first few slides showed that this pollution is in all these oceans. Has this gone to the level of the UN to say, hey, we need to really do something to clean this up? Is that happening?
Yeah, I wonder if I can just skip to the relevant slide here. So there have been some large-scale efforts to address the issue of ocean litter. So there's an EU Commission, the first ever European-wide strategy on plastic. So these are things that are happening at least a region-wide scale. And some of that is to encourage recycling of plastic. So recycle 55% of all products by 2030, to reduce single-use plastics, and to monitor and reduce marine litter. So that's a sort of continent-wide effort. There have been country-wide efforts. Individual countries are taking stances on things like banning plastic bags. There's a G7 Ocean Plastics Charter. So the most recent G7 meeting, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Britain, and the European Union signed this pledge to increase plastics recycling and to have reusable and recoverable plastics by 2030. So the United States and Japan are not signatories to that plan, to that pact. So again, this is something that has to be addressed as a sort of societal and political way. But there are, just to answer your questions, there are region-wide and global efforts to reducing the issue of ocean plastics and ocean.
Okay, just as a follow-on to that, so the countries here are all first world countries, and from your other slide, it looked like most of the pollution's coming out of the third world countries. Like, what's actually being done to assist third world countries to pollute less?
So the question is that first world countries may be, in some cases, taking the lead on plastics pollution, but what is happening in third world countries or developing countries? So in some cases, some countries are acting unilaterally because they recognize that in their own case that plastics problematic in their own environment. So some countries are acting individually. We know that poverty is often a great driving force, that really if people are living in poverty, then they're not necessarily able to prioritize the environment, but we know that human health and human quality of life is tied to a healthy environment. So I think we have to, as a global society, address the issues of poverty, address the issues of environmental quality so that everybody can live in a healthy environment and have, we hope an ocean that's free of plastic. Sure. Certainly, and I think population density also has a lot to do with it. The centers of population density. Yeah. Try. There we go. Start at the beginning, of course. Yeah. So this is. I'll just so you can see a lot of the sources of pollution are in East and Southeast Asia. So some of the some of the issues of concentration are that there's not adequate waste management systems. So that's something that we could support directly. We could support improvements in waste management, and that might address some of that. And really just poverty alleviation is that we need to work for a healthy environment for everybody. And then I'll just add with that so you can see the distribution. The question at the back?
Yes, thank you. I have a question. Do we know at all what the effects on human health is by ingesting the chemicals that are contained in plastics?
That's a great question. That is an active area of research. I heard there was a government study about the levels of BPA, which is a chemical additive found in plastics, as potentially not being problematic. It had been a concern for a while. So that's an area of active research. People are working on that. There's differences of opinion and different findings that are being shown right now. I'm sure there are studies of human health that show, well, I shouldn't be so certain. I know it's an active area of research about human health and plastic. It's not something I'm directly involved with.
Do we know what's going on the west coast of the United States that's resulting in mismanaged municipal waste? I'm surprised to see that light-colored band.
I can't address that directly. I know that we've had recent policy changes to try and address, trash and stormwater and other municipal management. So that may have changed recently, but I can't speak to the specifics of that. It's a good question.
So you were looking at pretty small filter feeders. Do you have any information about the impact that these plastics have on, or the ingestion by cetaceans?
There was a recent study that looked at the impact of plastics in dolphins, and I don't remember the exact findings, but I do know that large filter feeders like manta rays are directly ingesting them. I think the dolphin study was just showing that there are plastic or indicators of plastics in the tissues of cetaceans. And so I'm hoping to, so I'm working with Rachel Cartwright, who's Professor Emerita of Kelsey Chum Islands on the humpback whale project in Maui. So we're going to be doing some microplastics work in Maui up to January. So it's an area I'm really interested in, but I can't say that anybody really knows right now. Because obviously, organisms that filter a lot of ocean water, like baby whales and mantas and other filter feeders, are potentially ingesting a lot of plastics too. It's very difficult to do that kind of work just because they're very mobile, and it's hard to know with people and with large-bodied animals what the direct cause and effect is. So many different, as humans, we're exposed to so many different chemicals all the time. It's hard to really draw a line between, exposure and some negative outcome. But I think it's an area that people are looking into right now.
We'll take our last couple questions.
I was just going to say, in terms of the lady from Michigan here, we do a lot of education with the public here before they visit the park. That seems to be a pretty effective way, and there's a wake-up call for certain individuals not from California. Oh, no plastic bags? What do you mean? So we kind of go into that whole spiel, but not in a bad way, but in a way, hey, if you have them with you, no big deal. Put them in the bottom of the backpack, retrieve them later. And, role modeling that behavior, some of the skippers on the boat will stop the ocean, on the islands. See that and go, wow, why is he doing that? Why is he taking that balloon out of the ocean? So I think modeling that behavior, there's a lot more that we can do, of course, but I think we try to kind of get the people we can get and kind of educate them on the negatives of plastic in our ocean.
If I could just speak to that too, so education is really important, and just being aware of this as being a problem is really important. And although we might not necessarily see the very worst of plastic pollution in Southern California, everything's connected to the ocean. We're part of this, global society, and so we have to act. These are really big scale problems. Although we're addressing things locally, these are large scale problems that really require a lot of different partners and people from all around the world to address. So education and understanding the problem and being aware of it is really a very important steps for the work to do.
We'll take one last question.
Okay, so it's against international law to dump plastics in the ocean anywhere in the world. So on the enforcement side, how do they enforce not dumping plastics in the ocean?
That, I would say, is a very good question. That a lot of these places are sort of out of sight, out of mind, or that there's accidental losses. So yeah, it's against the law, but how do you enforce the law when you're 3,000 miles out into the ocean? I think we have to, take this problem one bite at a time, whether that's going to your local beach and picking up trash so it doesn't degrade into microplastics or wash out to the Channel Islands. That's one thing we can do. We can work with fishing communities to give them incentives, whether that's financial or other incentives, to recycle their gear that they might otherwise discard. So this is again, a global scale problem. It's going to require a lot of different solutions, and so we have to be as creative and inventive as we can to find solutions. That's one option that we can do. So thank you all for your interest. I'll be happy to talk more about policy or about research, about education. I'm very glad that you were able to be here, and maybe I'll see some of you this weekend doing coastal cleanups. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steele.